Ready?
Ready.
Hi, class. Today we'll be looking at our country of choice, which is Belize, and we're going to be looking at the profile. And my group members are Tiffany Troas, Tiffany Price, Jordan Samuels, and of course yours truly, Shanike Ritchie. And so as we look at Belize, we want to look at the language situation. And for us to look at the language situation in Belize, we have some focus areas. The first one is the historical influence on languages in Belize, the language situation, the current language situation in Belize, language planning and biography, and language death. Now, before we go any further, let's look at the historical influence on languages in Belize. Now, located on the Caribbean coast of Central America and bordering Mexico in the north and west, and Guatemala on the west and south, Belize has a land area of 22,966 square kilometers, which was densely forested. Now, the territory was first inhabited by the Mayan Indians. The Maya civilization that covered much of Central America incorporated Belize from around 2500 BC to AD 900. And the country has some spectacular and remarkably well-preserved ruins from this era. And there are still some 30 Maya villages in the south of Belize, which retain a traditional way of life. Now, they were Europeans who arrived in Belize. The British settlers, they arrived in 1638. The Spanish invaders, they set up scattered communities in Belize, and between 1650 and 700, Spanish raiders who constituted the main Spanish presence in the colony sought captives to work on the plantation in Cuba. Although significant numbers of Spaniards never settled in Belize, they claimed sovereignty over the territory and challenged the right of Britain to settle there. There were frequent conflicts between the British and the Spanish during the 18th century. The British, they were persistent and ultimately gained control of the territory. Belize in 1862, they were recognized as a British colony and named British Honduras. Now, there was also another group located in Belize around that time, the Garifuna. These are Caribs who settled along the coast of the Caribbean islands. Belize was one of such islands, and runaway slaves would seek refuge to these communities. Hence, the Garifuna group has a mix of African and Carib descent. Following the arrival of the Europeans were the Africans. The Africans arrived to fill the demand for enslaved laborers in the New World. And for Belize, they were shipped to Belize for the cutting of mahogany. Now, in an interview on Belize Melting Pot of Cultures, which is a source that we looked at, Belize is referred to as rice and beans. In other words, it's a melting pot. Belize culture is unique, a unique blend of European, East Indian, North American, African, Garifuna, Mestizo, and Mayan. This blend is also demonstrated in the array of languages spoken among the people. You have the Garifuna language, the Mayan languages, Spanish, English, Creole, and each group that is present in Belize, and those Europeans that came, they brought with them their own languages. The British, they brought English. The Spaniards, they brought with them Spanish. The Mayans, they have different types of languages. We're seeing two languages being displayed right now. The first one, I can't pronounce that one, but the other one, the Mopan language, the Garifuna, their language is referred to as the Garifuna as well. And then we have the the Belizean Creole, which is a unique mixture of languages. Now, while I was watching an interview on cultural relation in Belize, Channel 5, the interviewee mentioned that the Belizean Creole, it's not just limited to a mix of African and English language, but it's a mix of any of the languages that are present. It could be two or more than two languages. And so we're going to just dive a little deeper into the language situation in Belize and the variety of languages that are now present in Belize.
Okay, so the language situation in Belize is, can you, right? So the language situation in Belize is very interesting as Belize has many different cultures present, many different languages. So it's a very diverse language situation. Now, as you may or may not know, so Belize was previously known as British Honduras. So it was a British colony and it was known as British Honduras back when it was colonized by the Brits. Now, Belize has a history of slavery. So they were enslaved Africans there and they brought with them African languages. And then there were many other groups of settlers who came with their different languages. So next slide. So we have the Europeans who brought English and Spanish. So the official languages spoken, so the languages spoken in Belize, sorry, are English, Creole, Spanish, Garifuna, Mayan languages, Yucatec, Mopan, and Kekchi, German, and Chinese. Now, English and Spanish were brought to Belize by the Europeans. And next slide. Yeah, so English and Spanish were brought to Belize by the Europeans. Mayans were already present in Belize, and they brought with them their different Mayan languages, the Yucatec, the Mopan, and the Quechua. And now so for the Spanish language that is present in Belize, not only did the Europeans bring Spanish, but there are also different refugees from other Spanish-speaking countries like Honduras and Cuba, who also brought Spanish with them. So there are different varieties of Spanish present in Belize, and some speakers of some varieties of Spanish, like Cuban Spanish or Belizean Spanish, find it hard to understand each other because of the difference in variety of the Spanish. Now, Creole was widespread after the end of slavery when the enslaved Africans they were freed and they went on to move around to different parts of Belize and they spread out, had families. And then Garifuna was spread to different Caribbean countries after the Caribs settled in different countries. So the Garifuna language and Garifuna people they're not they're not very mixed, so not everybody speaks Garifuna, but you do have different groups of people who do speak Garifuna. And then you have the Mennonites who brought German to Belize in 1957. Now, the Mennonites came to Belize with their agricultural skills. So there was a need for agricultural skills. There was a need for greater need for farming in Belize. So the Mennonites came with their skills and with their languages, and they have their own separate communities that speak their German kind of away from everybody else. And then you also have the Chinese laborers who were brought in after slavery who came with their Chinese language, and they are kind of in their own little communities as well. So you don't have a lot of Belizean people are multilingual. Many Belizeans speak Creole, and then you have Spanish, which is the second most popular language. But you have those other languages like the Mayan languages and the German and the Chinese that are kind of isolated, and they're not in the general population. Do not have those languages as a part of their languages that they speak. Thanks, Tiffany.
All right. So, to zone in on the Belizean, country profile, we have to take a look at language planning. So, the definition we have for language planning here is that language planning, according to Roberts in 1988, is an official government level activity concerning the selection and promotion of a unified administrative language or languages. It represents a current effort by individuals, groups, or organizations to influence or language use or development. Sorry. Next slide. So if we take a look at what was said before Belize, it was British Honduras. We recognize that now, since it becomes Belize through the connections of Britain Honduras, Britain has an extensive influence on the language of English being the official status. So this is what we're basically saying here right now in this slide, that historically colonization played a major role in the language situation. And as a result of Britain being the head of state or having close relations, English automatically became the official status. All right. So this table that we have here shows shows that English, Spanish, Garifuna, and Belizean Creole are four of the main languages. They are separated by official language, what is the regional language, versus the minority, versus the widely spoken. So Lepage and Tubercular 1985 would have provided some insight into bilingualism in Belize through a consensus data from 1960. The findings basically generated this table. Based on the table, Spanish is seen as a regional language because it is so widely spoken. But we are to look at the demographics of this because majority of the countries that surround Belize are Spanish speaking countries, or they're very closely related to Mexican countries. So that is why we would say Spanish is a widely spoken language or a regional language because of the demographics. And next slide. So taking those into consideration, language planning comes into play because one, it focuses on whether these people could be influenced or their language could be influenced by the official status or the government or the geographical location of the area. So, depending on all of those instances or circumstances, we can look at the attitudes to the language, um, as we would have said in various videos that we watch or research done, that majority of the Belizean and even our interviewee stated that there was a negative stigma placed on Belizean Creole or Garifuna for that matter, which is why they have deterred from speaking that language, and that may lead to the death of a language. And so the language planning comes back into play because we're thinking of how can we create positive attributes towards these languages, which is the Garifuna and the Belizean Creole, and how can the government place an economic status or government support to say that these languages are widely accepted and can be used. Next slide. So we to maintain these languages, we have to take some steps to preserve the languages. And these are three steps that can be taken. One, the language can be preserved through education, music, and culture, which is a step that is being taken by Belize at this point, especially with the Garifuna language, seeing that it has become endangered. Two, making the language official. I mean, if the Belizean government does not make Belize Creole official, then it might become an endangered language, just like the Garifuna language, where people are struggling to keep the language
What
in the
time the
loop.
pharmacy close?
And lawfully, the government should acknowledge the Chart of Language Age Policy and Language Rights in the Creole speaking Caribbean. So this is not only a Belizean issue, but Belize should take into consideration these Charter of Rights, which will accept the language to, plan and have everyone using the language that they're comfortable with. And that's it for language planning.
Okay. Um, so moving on from language planning, we will go into language death, which we're talking about the preservation of a language. And what is language death? David Crystal defines language death as when the last speaker of a language dies. Also, it is important to note that language shift can lead to the death of a language, and this occurs when a speech community in a contact situation gradually using one of its two languages in favor of the other one. And we see this in Belize, for example, when the people in Belize are holding on to the Belizean Creole, where they would put aside, well, leave behind the Garifuna language and stick to speaking the Belizean Creole in communicative situations. Within Belize, it can be assessed that the indigenous language is endangered. However, there are measures in place to preserve the language based on what Tiffany just explained through culture. Other examples would come through folklore and stories, but the dominant, more casual language spoken is the Belizean Creole. Factors concerning language ideology and attitudes, there are micro and macro factors that determine how a language situation works in a speech community. These factors continues in the sense of changes in language from Garifuna to Belizean Creole, which can be in the sense of social change. Social change in terms of people moving from the rural area to the urban area for opportunities, work opportunities. Language contact, this influences change in language based on what a speaker's preference is. So people prefer to speak the Belizean Creole because possibly they're more comfortable speaking it because most of the people are already speaking it. And because most of the people are speaking it, it is easier to acquire that language. Young people are not speaking the language, or young parents are not teaching the language to their children. And we have to also look into who or what is the dominant linguistic group. And we see that the dominant linguistic group within Belize would be speakers of the Belizean Creole or slash English speakers. How many persons alive speaking the language endangered versus the language people shifted to? We realize that within Belize, the smaller group of people would be the people that are speaking um, the indigenous languages or the Spanish or the German or any other language that is there, and the greater number of people um, are the people that are speaking the Belizean Creole. And because people are shifting to the Belizean Creole, a language becomes endangered, and the Belizean Creole becomes the more dominant language, continues to become the more dominant language. Instances of language maintenance or language revitalization, people continue to speak the Belizean Creole. So the language is being maintained. People speak it within the work environment, church, and at home. So the language is being maintained. Are children still learning the language? Yes, they are. Children are growing up in households where parents continue to speak the Belizean Creole, and children are not growing up in households where the Garifuna language is being spoken for them to continue to learn the language. So we see here that the language continues to be endangered and the language continues to be maintained. The causes and effects of a language shift are many and lie at the intersection of a group of speakers, maintenance of two or more languages. We see where the maintenance of both English and Creole is being met and not the Garifuna language, although there are measures being put into place for the language to be maintained, but there are not a lot of speakers. The shift can fall under two categories, either structural effects of a language or social cultural factors. Structural effects of a language may include um, how the language is spoken and the different factors under culture, which is music and mass media, how the language is communicated within those platforms, the value assigned to the speakers themselves, how speakers value the language. We see here that people prefer to speak the Belizean Creole. So the Belizean Creole is the language that is valued. So that is the language being preserved and maintained on a wider scale. The language having covert prestige in the community as a marker of identity. We hear that, well, in the interview, it was noted that pronunciation can be a determining factor of um, prestige or social identity. A person would probably be looked down on based on how they pronounce a word, like you're talking badly. Um, and language variation, which speaks to the variety of languages being spoken versus what is endangered and what is being preserved. Factors relating to the Chinese and German languages, i.e., Spanish, based on what is explained to be a shift, change, or death of a language. It is safe to say that these languages are no longer spoken since the speakers of the language have died out. Spanish would not be considered a language largely spoken in Belize. However, in this case, one could take the stance to say that there is a shift to what is more popular, which is the Belizean Creole. In conclusion, language that is, or shift in Belize is one that will naturally occur because of the wide variety of languages spoken and as according to a person's preference in what they want to speak and what they want to learn and what they want to continue with. Therefore, it is only expected that speakers would naturally shift or change to what the majority language is. We therefore see that what is being continued or preserved as a language is what is of value to the people and what Belizeans see as what they are comfortable speaking. Now, to continue the final part of the presentation, we could let you hear parts of the interview that was done. And at approximately about 7:50, she talked about some aspects of pronunciation, which is here.
Yes, they add this emphasis to the front now, alligator, and I was like, okay, then. Yeah, it can vary
Okay.
depending on where you go.
Um, do you know anything about Mayan people or the Garifuna language? Was that ever used in your country back then? Or
I know very to be able to speak about it. I'm aware of the languages because, like in Belize, we have different types of Maya.
oh, okay.
So we have the Quechua, we have the Mopan, and we have the Yucatec
Here we have
Maya.
us talking about the
And
different.
so all of their languages vary.
Okay, so there is actually how should I say this, like a language variety.
Yes,
You guys speak
exactly.
Spanish?
So that was one part of where she would talk about pronunciations and variations and how we would assess how language death will come into place and preservation, etc. And thank you. That is the end of our presentation. Anybody else wants anything to say?
No, that would be all.
Thank you,
Yes.
everyone. So I'm going to stop now, right?
Yeah, sure.